It was a morning drenched in sunlight, the kind that fills your heart with hope and excitement. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her gown one last time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fastened the graduation cap. This was it, the day she'd been waiting for. After years of hard work, she would finally walk across that stage, a sense of accomplishment swelling in her chest. Yet something lingered in the back of her mind, something unspoken but present. Her parents. They had promised I'd be there. The words, so comforting then, now echoed with a hollow ring. They hadn't shown up to her high school graduation, but this was different. This was her college graduation. It meant the world to her. She checked her phone once more. Still no messages. A wave of doubt crept in, but she shook it off. They're just running late, she told herself. They'll be here soon. She gave one last glance at her reflection, then headed out of her room, trying to ignore the rising anxiety in her chest. The ceremony was about to begin. Sarah stood among her classmates, each of them caught in their own quiet moments of anticipation. The air was thick with excitement, but something about it felt distant to her. Her classmates were surrounded by their families, their loved ones, smiling and laughing. She should have been happy, excited even, but instead, she felt like an outsider in her own celebration. She checked her phone one more time. Still nothing. She tried to focus on the ceremony, to absorb the significance of the moment, but her mind kept drifting back to her parents. They had promised I'd be there after all. How could they not? This was the culmination of years of hard work. It didn't make sense. Her gaze shifted to the other families in the stands, laughing and cheering as their children prepared for their big moment. She swallowed hard, pushing back the tears, threatening to surface. She was proud, but she also felt more alone than ever. The ceremony began, and Sarah tried to immerse herself in the moment. The speeches were heartfelt, the applause deafening, yet it all felt so surreal. She kept glancing at the empty seats where her parents should have been, hoping to spot them in the crowd. But there was nothing. The stage lights glowed bright, but they couldn't chase away the shadows of doubt clouding her mind. The moment should felt like a triumph, but instead, it felt hollow. She felt as though she were a ghost, watching everyone else's joy, while her own happiness remained just out of reach. She tried to enjoy the applause, to savor the victory, but all she could hear was the silence from her parents. And with that silence, the void between them grew wider. When the ceremony ended, the crowd began to disperse. The excitement in the air was palpable, but Sarah felt like an intruder in a celebration that wasn't meant for her. She texted her parents again, but the reply still didn't come. Her heart sank lower with each passing second. Wait. A part of her had always known this day would come. They had skipped her high school graduation too. But it was different this time. This was her college graduation. Her moment. She had worked so hard for this. And yet here she was, standing alone in a sea of joyous families, hoping for something that was never going to come. She blinked back the tears that threatened to escape. She tried to hold her head high, but it felt impossible. This day should have been about her achievements, but all she could think about was the absence of the people who were supposed to care most. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself walking to a quiet corner of the campus, away from the crowds. She pulled out her phone again, hoping for something, anything, from her parents. She tapped out a simple message. "I'm here. Where are you?" She hit send and waited. But it felt like waiting for a reply from a distant world, one where her parents actually cared. She could hear the muffled sounds of laughter from the rest of the crowd, but it only made her feel more alone. No call, no text, no apology. No apology, just silence. And in that silence, she finally allowed herself to cry. It wasn't just about today. It was about every unfulfilled promise, every quiet disappointment that had built up over the years. As the ceremony continued, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. Around her, her classmates were surrounded by their families, celebrating their achievements. She sat alone, eyes scanning the crowd for her parents. She kept telling herself they would show up soon. It was her graduation day. How could they miss it? She checked her phone again, hoping for a message. But there was nothing. The silence felt louder than the applause that filled the air. She glanced at the empty seat beside her, the absence glaring back at her. She wanted to be happy for her success, but the absence of her parents made everything feel hollow. The joy of the ceremony felt distant, as if she were watching someone else's celebration. A wave of frustration and sadness hit her. She had worked so hard for this, and yet here she was, alone. She clenched her fist, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Sarah's heart began to sink as the ceremony continued. She had tried to push away the hurt, but it kept creeping in, drowning out the joy of her accomplishment. Maybe next time, she thought, remembering all the other times her parents had let her down. Every important moment in her life had been overshadowed by their absence, but today it felt different. This should have been their moment too. She had hoped that they would finally show up, that this time would be different. She tried to smile, to feel the pride she should be feeling, but it didn't come. Instead, all she felt was the overwhelming weight of their neglect. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but when she checked it there was nothing. No call, no message. It stung more than she cared to admit. She wasn't just hurt. She was exhausted from the cycle of hope and disappointment. After the ceremony, Sarah stepped outside, desperate for some air. The evening sky was fading, the pink and orange hues mixing with the growing darkness. She walked aimlessly, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Her phone vibrated again. It was a text from her mother. "Sorry we missed it. Hope you had a great time." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stood there frozen for a moment, staring at the message. "Hope you had a great time." How could they be so dismissive? The ceremony was over, and they couldn't even be bothered to offer more than a generic message. She fought the tears threatening to fall. With trembling hands, she typed out a reply. "You missed it again. I'm done waiting." She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the send button. Then, without another thought, she hit send. It was done. She wasn't going to wait anymore. Sarah wandered for a while, the weight of her decision settling in. The silence of the campus at night felt heavy, and the stars above seemed to echo her feelings of loneliness. She paused beside a fountain, the water glimmering in the soft light. She had finally made her choice. To stop waiting, to stop hoping for something that was never going to come. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a quiet, painful surrender. She wanted to believe that the world would get better, that things would change, but the reality was stark. They would never change. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her emotion. The phone buzzed in her pocket again. Her mother's name flashed on the screen. Sarah hesitated, not knowing what to expect, but finally, she answered. The conversation that followed only confirmed what she had already known. Nothing would ever change. The conversation with her mother was brief. Sarah had said nothing more than a quiet, "I understand," before ending the call. The words didn't hold the weight they once did. She stared at the darkening sky above, her emotions in turmoil. The stars seemed to shimmer, distant and cold, just like the relationship she had with her parents. She had been waiting for so long, always hoping they would come around, always hoping they would change. But she couldn't wait anymore. As the night grew colder, she realized she had to move on, not just from this day, but from the years of emotional neglect. She had to stop holding on to a hope that would never materialize. With one last glance at the campus, she turned and walked away, leaving behind the old version of herself that had kept waiting for things to be different. Sarah's breath was shallow as she walked away from the fountain, her phone still gripped tightly in her hand. She was trying to steady her emotions, but a heavy knot in her stomach wouldn't let go. The decision she'd made felt both liberating and terrifying at the same time. She had finally done it, cut herself off from the cycle of disappointment. But as she walked toward the parking lot, she felt an unfamiliar weight in her chest. Was this really the right decision? Her phone buzzed again, and she hesitated for a moment before looking at the screen. It was a call from her mother. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. Should she answer it? After everything, what could her mother possibly say now? She stood still, the tension in her body growing as the phone rang louder in her ear. The decision she had just made was already being tested. Sarah finally answered the call. "Sarah," her mother said, her voice tentative as if testing the waters. "I'm sorry we missed your graduation. You know how busy we've been with work." The words felt like a soft blow to the chest, but Sarah stayed quiet, not wanting to show weakness. Her mother continued, "We really wanted to be there, but something came up last minute. I hope you understand." Sarah closed her eyes, holding her breath as the sting of her mother's words settled deep within her. She had heard this before: excuses, apologies that didn't feel sincere, promises that always fell short. "I understand," Sarah finally said, her voice barely a whisper. But inside, she was seething. No more excuses, she thought. She couldn't keep accepting these half-hearted apologies. It was time to face the truth. As Sarah listened to her mother's voice on the other end, the same numbness she had always felt crept in. She could hear her mother's attempts to explain, but it all felt like empty words. There was no real apology, no real remorse for missing out on such an important day. It was just another excuse. And this time, Sarah wasn't going to take it anymore. As her mother continued speaking, Sarah's mind began to clear. The truth was settling in, finally making itself known. She had been living for their approval for so long, hoping they would finally see her. But now, it didn't matter. It wasn't her fault that they couldn't be there for her. They had made their choices, and it was time for Sarah to make hers. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice steady and firm. "I can't do this anymore. I need space." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could feel her heart pounding as she waited for her mother's response. Finally, her mother's voice came through, quieter now. I didn't realize it had come to this." Sarah's stomach churned. That was it. No real acknowledgement of the years of neglect. Just a vague recognition that things were bad, without the genuine apology she had been longing for. Sarah's mind raced, and in that moment, she understood something deep within herself. She wasn't going to wait for their approval anymore. She didn't need it. She had done everything on her own, and her success was not dependent on their presence. She wasn't going to be tied to this cycle of disappointment anymore. "I need to go," she said softly, before ending the call. There was nothing more to say. It was over. Sarah stood there for a few moments, her phone now silent in her hand. The cool night air felt like a fresh start, a moment of clarity. She had cut the ties, taken control of her own life. As she stood under the vast sky, the stars above her seemed to shine a little brighter. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. The years of longing for something that would never come were behind her now. She could feel her shoulders relax, the tension easing from her body. She didn't need their validation. She had made it this far on her own, and now she could move forward, unburdened. She took a deep breath and looked up at the stars. It was time to embrace the unknown, to step into the future without the weight of her parents' absence dragging her down. The days following the phone call were a blur. Sarah kept thinking about the conversation, replaying it in her mind over and over again. She had done it. She had finally said what needed to be said, but there was a lingering sense of uncertainty. The silence from her parents was deafening, and yet it gave her a strange sense of peace. She knew deep down that she had to move forward, but the weight of years of neglect still haunted her. She had always done everything for them, hoped for their approval, and it never came. She couldn't go on like this anymore. As she sat at her desk, staring at her phone, she realized that this wasn't just about her graduation. It was about reclaiming her life. She couldn't keep waiting for them to change. It was time to stop living for their approval. The decision hit her like a wave. She wasn't going to wait any longer. It was time to move on, even if it meant walking away completely. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of her parents, of the future. The weight of the decision she had made felt heavier than she expected. Was it really the right choice? She had always tried to hold on to the hope that one day things would be different, but with each passing year, she realized that nothing was going to change. Phone call had been the final straw. The realization hit hard. She had been holding on to a dream that was never going to come true. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about freeing herself from the emotional weight they had placed on her. Her thoughts drifted to the day of her graduation, the empty seat, the silence. It had been the moment that solidified everything. That was the day she knew she had to make a choice. And now, the choice was clear. She couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't there. The next morning, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity. The decision was hers now, and she couldn't keep looking back. She thought about all the moments where her parents had promised to be there, only to break their word. The graduation had been the tipping point, but the truth had been there all along. She had been seeking validation from the wrong place, and the time had come to stop. She wasn't going to waste any more energy on something that had never been hers to begin with. With a steady breath, Sarah picked up her phone. She hesitated for only a moment before dialing her parents' number. This wasn't a call to seek forgiveness or understanding. It was the final step in her journey toward freedom. The phone rang, and she waited. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she had to do this. The phone call was brief. Her parents' voice came through on the other end, but Sarah was already prepared for what they would say. Apologies, excuses, the same words that had never meant anything. "We're sorry we've let you down," they said. "We never meant for it to be like this." But Sarah wasn't interested in hearing the same old story. She didn't want an apology that would be forgotten in a week. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need space from you both. I need to focus on my life and move forward, and I can't do that with you in it." There was a long silence on the other end. She could hear her parents trying to find the right words, but Sarah knew there was nothing they could say anymore. "Goodbye," she said softly, before ending the call. As she set the phone down, Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The final decision had been made. Sarah sat in silence for a few moments, letting the finality of the decision sink in. The weight that had been hovering over her for so long finally lifted. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt in control of her own life. She didn't need her parents' approval or validation to be happy. She had achieved everything on her own, and now it was time to live for herself. The phone call had been the moment she had been avoiding for years, but now that it was over, she felt free. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. The sun was shining brightly, and the world seemed full of possibility. With a final deep breath, Sarah smiled. She was ready to embrace the next chapter of her life, unburdened by the past. In the days that followed, Sarah felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The silence from her parents was deafening, but she realized she no longer needed their validation to move forward. She spent more time focusing on her own goals, her dreams, and her happiness. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for someone else's approval. She began to rebuild her life, piece by piece, creating new memories and connections with people who truly cared for her. Sarah's confidence grew stronger with each passing day. Her friends noticed the change in her. She was no longer the person who would shrink in the shadow of others' expectations. She was stepping into her own power, and it felt incredibly freeing. There was a quiet peace in her soul now, a peace that had been missing for far too long. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. Sarah sat at a cafe one afternoon, her favorite book in hand. She had started doing things for herself, taking trips, signing up for classes, trying new hobbies. She had always held back, afraid of stepping too far out of line, afraid of disappointing her parents. But now, she was doing everything she had always wanted to do. It was liberating. Her phone buzzed with a notification, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text message from her mother, an apology, a request to reconnect. Sarah felt the familiar tug of guilt, but this time, it was different. She no longer felt the need to respond immediately or drop everything to please them. She put the phone back down on the table, refocusing on her book. For the first time in a long time, she was prioritizing herself. As the weeks passed, Sarah continued to grow more and more comfortable with her decision. She started reaching out to other family members, building connections that were healthier, more supportive. The emotional distance from her parents no longer felt like a loss. It felt like freedom. She began to realize that love wasn't about obligation. It was about respect, trust, and mutual support. She wasn't losing her family. She was creating a new definition of what family meant to her. One evening, she received a call from her best friend, telling her about a new job opportunity in another city. Sarah felt the spark of excitement in her chest. She had always dreamed of moving away, starting fresh somewhere new, but fear had always held her back. This time she didn't hesitate. She said yes. The day Sarah left for her new city was bittersweet. She packed her bags with a sense of excitement, but also a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She wasn't leaving behind the people who truly mattered. She was leaving behind the version of herself that had waited for approval. She had become someone new, someone strong enough to stand on her own. As she drove away, the familiar sights of her hometown grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. Sarah smiled, knowing she was heading toward a future that was all her own. She had finally found the courage to step into the unknown, and for the first time in years, she felt ready for it. Sarah settled into her new city, and the first few months were everything she had hoped for and more. She was learning new things about herself, taking on challenges she once thought impossible. Every success, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But more importantly, she was learning to love herself, to honor her own needs and dreams. She stopped seeking external validation, realizing that the only approval she needed was her own. One evening, as she sat on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had built this life, one step at a time, free from the weight of others' expectations. And she knew that she would continue to grow, continue to choose herself every single day. Months passed since Sarah's decision, and life felt different. She no longer sought validation from her parents or anyone else. Her focus shifted entirely to herself, her goals, her happiness. With each passing day, she found herself more at peace. She spent time building new relationships, deepening her bonds with supportive friends, and embracing a life that wasn't dictated by the expectations of others. The silence from her parents remained, but it no longer hurt. She had made her peace, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt she was truly thriving, not just surviving. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter from her parents. It was filled with apologies and explanations, but as she read it, she realized it didn't matter anymore. She had already healed, and no apology could change what had happened. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, knowing that her peace had already come from within. She didn't need their words to move forward. Her life was hers to shape, and it had already begun. As time went on, Sarah found herself offering support to others who were struggling with feelings of neglect or abandonment. She had walked the same painful road, but now she was able to help others find their own strength. She became a source of wisdom and comfort, teaching others the same lessons she had learned. That self-worth isn't dependent on anyone's approval. Helping others in this way brought her a sense of purpose, and she realized that her healing journey had a greater meaning than she ever imagined. One evening, Sarah received an invitation from her best friend to a small celebration. It was a gathering for the people in her life who had supported her along the way. As she read the message, she realized how much had changed. She wasn't the same person who had once been desperate for her parents' approval. She had created her own family, one built on mutual love and respect. The invitation wasn't just for a party. It was a recognition of the new life she had built, one filled with love that came from the people who truly mattered. At the gathering, Sarah looked around at the faces of her friends, people who had stood by her, who had watched her grow. For the first time, she truly understood what family meant, not those bound by blood, but by love and choice. Surrounded by those who loved her, Sarah felt at home. She had found her place in the world, and it wasn't in seeking approval from her parents. It was in embracing the love that was already present in her life. Sarah's life continued to unfold, each day bringing new experiences, new opportunities, and a deeper understanding of herself. She had built a life beyond the constraints of her past, beyond the pain of unfulfilled promises. Her job was thriving, her friendships growing stronger, and her heart, once heavy with abandonment, was now filled with self-love. As the months passed, Sarah took more chances. She traveled, explored new passions, and immersed herself in everything life had to offer. She was no longer waiting for something to change. She was actively creating the life she had always wanted. For the first time in years, she could see a future that was bright, and it was hers alone to shape. One day, as Sarah walked through the city, she noticed how much had changed within her. She was no longer the person she once was, the person who sought validation from others. She had become someone who was comfortable in her own skin, someone who didn't need anyone's approval to feel worthy. Her parents' absence no longer felt like a void. It had been replaced by a sense of empowerment. She had learned to value herself, to trust her instincts, and to embrace the life she had built. It was a quiet confidence that came from within, and she realized that she had always been enough. The life she had now was a testament to her strength, her resilience, and her decision to walk away from what no longer served her. One evening, Sarah sat by the window of her apartment, watching the sun set behind the skyline. As the sky turned from orange to purple, she thought about everything she had gone through to get to this point. She had healed, grown, and learned to trust herself in ways she never thought possible. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. She was proud of the woman she had become. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. The weight of the past had long since lifted, and in its place was a quiet contentment that came from knowing she had chosen herself. As Sarah continued to embrace the life she had built, she realized there was one thing she had never truly understood before. Happiness wasn't found in other people's approval. It was found within herself. She had been searching for it in all the wrong places, but now she knew it was hers to claim. And as she stood in her apartment that evening, surrounded by the warmth of her new life, she understood that her journey had led her exactly where she needed to be. She had let go of the past, and in doing so had created space for everything beautiful to come. She was ready for whatever came next, because now she knew she was capable of handling anything. As Sarah walked out the door one last time, leaving behind the apartment and the city she had come to call home, she felt a surge of excitement. She wasn't running away. She was moving forward, stepping into a new chapter of her life. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew she was ready. With every step, she felt more in control of her own destiny. This was her journey, and she was no longer afraid. She had everything she needed within herself. With a final glance behind her, she closed the door, knowing that whatever was waiting for her, she would face it with the strength and courage she had discovered along the way.